Hey guys, tonight we dive into what happens when imperial efficiency meets spectacular stubbornness in the shortest war in recorded history. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, where the British Empire demonstrated that sometimes the best diplomatic solution is 38 minutes of sustained naval bombardment. So before we witness this masterclass in gunboat diplomacy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching historical train wrecks unfold in real time. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us for these tales of spectacular political miscalculation from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe brew some tea if you're feeling properly British, and let's settle in for tonight's journey together. So, you think you could have advised Sultan Khalid on his career choices? Charming, really like a goldfish offering swimming lessons to a shark. Picture this: you wake up on a Tuesday morning in August 1896, stretch, contemplate your breakfast porridge, and before you can finish your first cup of tea, an entire war has erupted, raged, and concluded with the kind of efficiency that would make a Swiss train conductor weep with envy. This wasn't some gentle disagreement settled over crumpets and diplomatic courtesy. This was 38 minutes of the Royal Navy explaining to a stubborn sultan why it's unwise to ignore British suggestions, delivered with the subtle nuance of industrial-grade artillery. Tonight, we're exploring the Anglo-Zanzibar War, where political ambition met overwhelming firepower, where palace walls discovered they weren't as permanent as advertised, and where an entire sultanate learned that British patience has very specific time limits. This is the story of the shortest war in history, and trust me, it's exactly as one-sided as it sounds. Picture this: you've just woken up on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning in August 1896. You stretch, yawn, maybe contemplate whether your breakfast porridge will be lumpy or merely disappointing. And before you can even finish your first cup of tea, an entire war has started, raged and concluded. Not just any war, mind you, but what historians would later call the shortest war in recorded history. Lasting a mere 38 minutes, this wasn't some gentle diplomatic disagreement resolved over cucumber sandwiches. This was the Anglo-Zanzibar War, a spectacular demonstration of what happens when British gunboat diplomacy meets stubborn royal pride. Seasoned with a generous helping of imperial arrogance and served with a side of complete military annihilation, the story begins, as many spectacularly bad decisions do, with a death and a succession crisis. Sultan Hamad bin Thawani, the British friendly ruler of Zanzibar, had the poor timing to die on August 25, 1896. It is widely believed he was poisoned by his nephew Khalid bin Bargash, though proving murder in 1896 was about as reliable as weather forecasting is today. What we do know is that within hours of Uncle Hamad's conveniently timed demise, young Khalid had moved into the palace with all the subtlety of a peacock at a funeral. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like the beginning of a Shakespearean tragedy, you're not wrong. But this particular drama had a distinctly Victorian flavour, complete with moral indignation, overwhelming firepower, and the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that only comes from centuries of practice at telling other people what to do. The British, you see, had very specific ideas about who should and shouldn't be Sultan of Zanzibar. Khalid bin Bargash was definitely in the shouldn't category. From the British perspective, Khalid represented everything wrong with local leadership. He was unpredictable, potentially hostile to British interests, and worst of all, he hadn't asked permission. The audacity of seizing power without consulting the British first was rather like redecorating someone else's house while they were out buying groceries. Technically, it might have been his house to begin with, but that was beside the point. The British preferred their puppet rulers to be, well, properly puppeted. The British had already selected their preferred candidate, Hamad bin Mohammed, Khalid's cousin, who had the crucial qualification of being considerably more amenable to British suggestions. In the grand chess game of colonial politics, Hamad was a well-trained pawn who could be counted upon to move in the right directions. Khalid, on the other hand, showed distressing signs of independent thought. So there sat Khalid in the palace, probably enjoying what he imagined would be a long and prosperous reign, blissfully unaware that he had roughly 48 hours left as Sultan. The British were already sharpening their diplomatic knives and, more importantly, loading their naval guns. This wasn't going to be a lengthy negotiation. The Empire had a schedule to keep. The British response was swift, decisive, and about as subtle as a rhinoceros in a china shop. On August 26th, Rear Admiral Harry Rawson assembled what could only be described as a floating demonstration of why it's unwise to annoy the Royal Navy. The British gathered 2 cruisers, 3 gunboats, 150 Marines and sailors, and 900 Zanzibaris in the harbour area. This wasn't a diplomatic mission so much as a maritime intervention with delusions of politeness. Admiral Rawson was the sort of man who approached problems with the methodical precision of someone who had spent his entire career turning complex political situations into simple military ones. His solution to the Khalid problem was elegantly straightforward: ask him nicely to leave, and if he declined, blow up his palace until he changed his mind. It was diplomacy Victorian style, where the carrot was a polite letter and the stick was several tons of naval artillery. The ultimatum delivered to Khalid was a masterpiece of British understatement. In essence, it said, "Dear Sultan Khalid, we've noticed you're occupying a throne that doesn't belong to you. Please vacate the premises by 9 a.m. tomorrow, or we'll be forced to remove you with extreme prejudice. Yours sincerely, Her Majesty's Navy, P.S. We've brought some rather large guns to make our point more effectively." Khalid's response was either admirably brave or spectacularly foolish, depending on your perspective. Instead of demurely backing down, Khalid bin Bargash barricaded himself in the palace with around 800 defenders. His reasoning seems to have been that if he was going to lose his throne, he might as well go down fighting. It was the kind of noble gesture that looks much better in history books than it does when you're actually facing down the business end of British naval cannons. The palace defences were impressive by local standards, but laughably inadequate by Royal Navy standards. Khalid's forces consisted mainly of palace guards armed with rifles that were modern by East African standards, which is to say they were only about 20 years behind European military technology. They had constructed barricades, positioned themselves strategically, and prepared for what they imagined would be a siege. What they got instead was something closer to a very loud, very brief demolition project. The British force was overwhelming in every measurable way. They had superior firepower, superior training, superior technology, and superior numbers. More importantly, they had the kind of casual confidence that comes from having spent the better part of a century convincing the world that British military superiority was a natural law rather than a historical accident. This wasn't going to be a battle so much as an educational demonstration. As the night of August 26th wore on, both sides prepared for what everyone knew was inevitable. The British checked their weapons, reviewed their firing solutions, and probably enjoyed a good night's sleep secure in the knowledge that tomorrow's work would be brief and decisive. Khalid's defenders spent the night in the considerably less comfortable position of knowing they were about to face impossible odds with inadequate equipment and no realistic hope of victory. The deadline was set for 9 a.m. on August 27, 1896. As dawn broke over Zanzibar, the harbour presented a scene of almost theatrical drama. The British warships sat in the water like sleeping predators, their guns trained on the palace with mechanical precision. On shore, Khalid's forces waited behind their barricades, probably wondering if their last meal had been adequately satisfying. At exactly 9 a.m., the British ultimatum expired. Khalid had not abdicated. He had not fled. He had not even sent a polite note explaining his position. From the British perspective, this constituted a clear rejection of their reasonable request. From Khalid's perspective, it was probably the last moment of his reign that he got to enjoy in relative quiet. What happened next was less a battle than a very efficient administrative procedure conducted with high explosives. Admiral Rawson gave the order to open fire, and the British naval guns spoke with the kind of authority that only comes from centuries of practice at settling international disputes through superior firepower. The bombardment began at 9:02 a.m., and it was immediately clear that this was going to be a very one-sided conversation. The British gunboat bombardment of the Sultan's palace that lasted for 38 minutes was, as one observer noted, like watching a modern military demolish ancient fortifications. The palace, which had seemed so substantial and impressive from the inside, proved to be remarkably fragile when subjected to sustained naval artillery fire. The sound was indescribable. Imagine every thunderstorm you've ever experienced, compressed into a single continuous roar and amplified until the very air seemed to shake. The palace walls, which had stood for decades as symbols of royal power, crumbled like sandcastles facing an incoming tide. Windows exploded inward, sending showers of glass across the courtyards, where Khalid's defenders were desperately trying to find something solid to hide behind. Khalid's return fire was brave but utterly ineffective. His guards' rifles, adequate for maintaining order among restless subjects, made about as much impression on British naval armour as thrown pebbles would make on a charging elephant. The palace's defensive cannons, such as they were, managed a few shots before being systematically destroyed by the overwhelming British firepower. It was rather like watching a house cat attempt to intimidate a pack of wolves. The British guns were operated by men who had trained for years to do exactly this sort of thing with mechanical efficiency. Each shot was precisely aimed, methodically delivered, and devastatingly effective. They weren't firing wildly or emotionally. They were conducting a careful demolition project that happened to involve hostile targets. The palace was being systematically reduced to rubble by professionals who approached their work with the same methodical precision a carpenter might use to build a cabinet. Inside the palace, the situation was deteriorating rapidly from bad to catastrophic. The defenders, who had begun the morning with at least theoretical hope of survival, were quickly discovering that hope and naval artillery exist in an inverse relationship. The walls that were supposed to protect them were becoming sources of deadly debris. The courtyards that were meant to provide defensive positions were turning into killing zones filled with flying masonry and exploding ordnance. Khalid himself was experiencing the unique terror that comes from realizing that your worst case scenario was actually your best case scenario. The British weren't just going to defeat him, they were going to erase him and his entire position from the map, with the kind of thoroughness that comes from having unlimited ammunition and a strict schedule to maintain. The palace's famous clock tower, a symbol of royal authority visible throughout Zanzibar, became one of the war's most dramatic casualties. British shells struck it repeatedly, sending the massive timepiece crashing down in a cascade of gears, springs, and shattered stone. The symbolism was hard to miss. Khalid's time was literally up, and the British were making sure everyone in Zanzibar could see it happening. As the bombardment continued, it became increasingly clear that Khalid's position was not just untenable, but actively dangerous to occupy. The palace was being systematically destroyed around him, room by room and wall by wall. His defenders were being killed or wounded by flying debris and direct hits. The very air was full of dust, smoke, and the acrid smell of high explosives. This wasn't a siege that might last weeks or months. This was an execution that was taking slightly longer than expected due to the palace's inconvenient architecture. About 15 minutes into the bombardment, parts of the palace began to catch fire. This added a new dimension of urgency to an already desperate situation. Not only were Khalid and his remaining defenders being systematically shelled into submission, they were also facing the prospect of being burned alive in their own fortress. The smoke from the fires mixed with the dust from the explosions, creating a choking fog that made it difficult to see, breathe, or think clearly about escape routes. The British, meanwhile, were conducting their bombardment with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from a job being done correctly. Admiral Rawson observed the destruction through his telescope with the detached interest of a man watching a particularly effective fireworks display. His guns were performing exactly as designed, his crews were operating with textbook precision, and his enemy was being eliminated on schedule. From a purely military perspective, it was a nearly perfect operation. By 20 minutes into the war, Khalid's defensive capabilities had been essentially eliminated. His cannons were destroyed, his walls were breached or collapsed, and his remaining defenders were either dead, wounded, or seriously reconsidering their career choices. The palace that had seemed so imposing at dawn was now a smoking ruin that looked like it had been abandoned for decades, rather than attacked for minutes. The psychological impact on Khalid must have been crushing. He had begun the morning as Sultan of Zanzibar, ruler of an important East African kingdom, master of his own destiny. Now he was a man hiding in the ruins of his own palace, while the British Navy systematically demolished everything he had claimed to rule. The transformation from sovereign to refugee had taken less time than it takes most people to eat breakfast. But Khalid was nothing if not persistent. Even as his palace crumbled around him, even as his defenders fell or fled, even as it became obvious that continued resistance was not just futile but actively suicidal, he refused to surrender. Whether this was courage, stubbornness, or simple shock, it prolonged the war by precious minutes that must have felt like hours to everyone involved. The British response to this continued resistance was to increase the intensity of their bombardment. If Khalid wouldn't leave voluntarily, they would simply remove the palace from around him. More shells, bigger explosions, faster demolition. The message was clear. This would end when Khalid was no longer in the palace, either because he had left voluntarily, or because there was no palace left to occupy. Around the 30-minute mark, even Khalid's most loyal defenders were beginning to suggest that perhaps a strategic withdrawal might be preferable to certain death in a collapsing building. The palace was now more ruin than structure, more debris field than royal residence. The fires were spreading, the walls were falling, and the British showed no signs of running out of ammunition or patience. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after such sustained drama. Khalid, recognizing that his choice had been reduced to fleeing or dying, finally chose discretion over valor. He gathered what remained of his household, slipped out of the back of the palace, and made his way to the German consulate, where he requested asylum. The gesture was rather like jumping out of a burning building and then claiming it was a planned evacuation. But under the circumstances, maintaining dignity was less important than maintaining life. The moment Khalid abandoned the palace, the resistance effectively ended. His remaining defenders, no longer bound by loyalty to a sultan who was no longer present, began surrendering or fleeing as rapidly as dignity and circumstances would allow. The British, observing that they were now bombarding an essentially empty building, ceased fire at 9:40 a.m. The war, lasting less than 3/4 of an hour, was over. In 38 minutes, the British had deposed a sultan, destroyed a palace, eliminated organised resistance, and established their preferred candidate on the throne. It was efficiency that would have impressed a factory manager and devastated a nation. The immediate aftermath was a study in contrasts. Admiral Rawson, having completed his mission with textbook precision, was already preparing his reports for the Admiralty. His crews were securing their weapons and beginning the process of returning to their normal peacetime routines. For them, this had been a brief but successful training exercise with live ammunition and actual targets. For the people of Zanzibar, the situation was rather different. They had awakened to find themselves subjects of Sultan Khalid and gone to sleep as subjects of Sultan Hamid, with a brief interlude during which their capital city had been subjected to sustained naval bombardment. The transition of power had been achieved, but at a cost that would be remembered for generations. Despite lasting only 38 minutes, the war included an artillery battle and naval action which claimed around 500 lives. Most of these casualties were among Khalid's defenders, who had paid the ultimate price for their loyalty to a cause that had never had any realistic chance of success. The disparity in casualties was stark. The British suffered one wounded sailor, while Khalid's forces were virtually annihilated. The palace itself was a total loss. What had been a symbol of royal power and architectural achievement was now a smoking pile of rubble that would take years to clear away. The famous clock tower, the ornate walls, the ceremonial halls where generations of sultans had held court, all reduced to debris by 38 minutes of professional naval gunnery. Khalid, safely ensconced in the German consulate, was now a sultan without a sultanate, a ruler without anything to rule. The Germans, displaying the kind of diplomatic pragmatism that comes from being neighbours to the British Empire, made it clear that, while they were happy to provide temporary asylum, they had no intention of challenging British authority on Khalid's behalf. He was welcome to stay until he could make other arrangements, but those arrangements would not include returning to power in Zanzibar. The British, meanwhile, were already installing Hamid bin Mohammed as the new sultan. Hamid, who had wisely spent the morning well away from any buildings likely to be shelled, was probably relieved that his path to the throne had been cleared so efficiently. He would prove to be exactly the kind of cooperative, British, friendly ruler that the empire preferred, one who understood that independence was a privilege that could be revoked with 38 minutes' notice. The speed and decisiveness of the British victory sent a clear message throughout the region. This was what happened to local rulers who forgot their place in the imperial hierarchy. The British weren't just willing to use force to maintain their authority. They were willing to use overwhelming, devastating force that would eliminate resistance so quickly that potential rebels wouldn't have time to second guess their loyalty. The economic aftermath was almost as brutal as the military action itself. The British forced them to pay reparations covering the cost of the short war and for the damage caused by the looting, all of which amounted to 300 Zalozan rupees. This was rather like being forced to pay for the rope used to hang you, except in this case, it was being forced to pay for the shells used to demolish your palace. The British had not only won the war, they had made the losing side pay for the privilege of being defeated. From a purely military perspective, the Anglo-Zanzibar War was a masterpiece of efficient force projection. The British had identified a problem, assembled the necessary resources, delivered an ultimatum, and when that ultimatum was rejected, eliminated the problem with minimal expenditure of time, resources, or British lives. It was colonialism distilled to its essence. Overwhelming technological superiority applied with bureaucratic precision to achieve political objectives. But the war was also a demonstration of the brutal reality of imperial power. The British hadn't won because their cause was just or their claims were legitimate. They had won because they had better guns, more ships, and the institutional experience to use both effectively. Khalid's resistance had been brave but meaningless. Courage without adequate firepower is just a prelude to disaster. The international response to the war was muted, partly because it was over before most of the world had time to form an opinion about it. By the time newspapers in Europe and America had reported that there was a crisis in Zanzibar, the crisis had been resolved, the palace had been demolished, and the new sultan was already holding audiences. It was rather difficult to work up outrage about a conflict that had lasted less time than a church service. The speed of the British victory also meant that there was no time for other powers to intervene or even object. The Germans, French, and other colonial powers were still formulating their responses to the succession crisis when they received news that the crisis was over and a British-approved sultan was firmly in place. Diplomatic protests after the fact seemed rather pointless, especially given the efficiency with which the British had achieved their objectives. For Khalid personally, the war marked the beginning of a long and uncomfortable exile. After spending several days in the German consulate, he was eventually allowed to leave Zanzibar for German East Africa, where he would spend the next several years as a rather expensive guest of the German colonial administration. His dreams of ruling Zanzibar had lasted exactly 38 minutes longer than British patience. The new Sultan, Hamad bin Mohammed, proved to be exactly what the British had hoped for: compliant, cooperative, and completely understanding of where real power lay in Zanzibar. He would rule for several years without causing the British any significant problems, which, from their perspective, was the entire point of having a sultan in the first place. His reign would be remembered for its stability, prosperity, and complete lack of naval bombardments. The physical reconstruction of Zanzibar took considerably longer than its conquest had. The palace ruins had to be cleared, the damaged buildings repaired, and the infrastructure rebuilt. The process took months and served as a daily reminder to the population of what happened when local authorities challenged British preferences. Every piece of debris that was carted away, every wall that was rebuilt, was a lesson in the consequences of political miscalculation. The British forces that had conducted the bombardment were soon deployed elsewhere in the empire, carrying with them the satisfaction of a job efficiently done. For them, the Anglo-Zanzibar War was a brief but perfect example of how superior firepower and professional training could resolve political problems with minimal fuss and maximum effectiveness. It was the kind of small, successful action that military careers were built on. Admiral Rawson's report to the Admiralty was a model of bureaucratic understatement. Mission accomplished, objectives achieved, minimal casualties, substantial savings in time and resources compared to a prolonged siege. The report mentioned the 38-minute duration almost as an afterthought, as if such efficiency was simply the natural result of proper planning and professional execution. The war's brevity became its most famous characteristic, but that brevity was only possible because of the overwhelming disparity in military capabilities between the two sides. The British didn't win quickly because they were particularly clever or lucky. They won quickly because they brought industrial age weaponry to a conflict with forces equipped for an earlier era of warfare. It was rather like watching a modern army fight medieval knights. The outcome was never in doubt, only the duration. But the speed of the victory also meant that the war's deeper implications were often overlooked. This wasn't just a quick military action, it was a demonstration of how completely the European powers had transformed the balance of power in Africa. Local rulers, no matter how brave or determined, simply could not resist European military technology when it was applied with serious intent. The psychological impact on other African rulers was profound. The message was clear: cooperation with European colonial authorities was not really optional. Resistance would be met not with negotiation or compromise, but with overwhelming force applied with devastating efficiency. The 38 minutes it took to destroy Khalid's palace were 38 minutes that redefined the political possibilities throughout East Africa. For the ordinary people of Zanzibar, the war was a traumatic introduction to the realities of colonial power. They had lived through a change of government that was simultaneously violent and brief, devastating and efficient. Their city had been subjected to naval bombardment, their palace had been destroyed, and their sultan had been replaced, all in less time than it took to cook a proper meal. The war also demonstrated the peculiar nature of late 19th century colonialism, where local political crises could be resolved with industrial-scale violence applied for remarkably short periods. The British hadn't needed to occupy Zanzibar for months or years. They had simply needed to apply enough force, quickly enough, to make continued resistance impossible. Looking back, the Anglo-Zanzibar War seems almost surreal in its brevity and decisiveness. In an age when wars typically lasted years and consumed enormous resources, here was a conflict that was over before most people realized it had started. It was warfare compressed to its absolute essence. Political objectives achieved through the application of superior force in the minimum possible time. The war's legacy was complex. On one hand, it demonstrated the effectiveness of modern military technology in the hands of disciplined professionals. On the other hand, it showed the brutal efficiency with which European powers could eliminate any challenge to their authority in their colonial territories. The 38 minutes of bombardment represented years of accumulated imperial experience in converting political problems into military solutions. For military historians, the Anglo-Zanzibar War became a fascinating case study in force projection and diplomatic coercion. The British had achieved their objectives with minimal cost and maximum efficiency, exactly as imperial policy demanded. It was colonialism at its most brutally effective, stripped of any pretense about civilizing missions or cultural improvement. For the people of Zanzibar, the war became a story passed down through generations, the day the British Navy rewrote their political future in 38 minutes of concentrated violence. The speed of the transformation was as shocking as its completeness. One moment they had been subjects of Sultan Khalid, the next they were subjects of Sultan Hamid, with nothing between those two realities except the sound of naval guns and the sight of their palace collapsing into rubble. The war's place in history was secured not by its strategic importance or its long-term consequences, but by its sheer brevity. The war, lasting less than 3/4 of an hour, is sometimes considered the shortest in recorded history. It became a historical curiosity, a footnote that demonstrated the extreme efficiency with which 19th century European powers could eliminate challenges to their authority. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Anglo-Zanzibar War was how completely it achieved its objectives in such a short time. The British had wanted to replace Khalid with Hamid, and they did. They had wanted to demonstrate their power, and they did. They had wanted to discourage future resistance, and they did. all accomplished in 38 minutes of professional naval gunnery that reduced a palace to rubble and a sultan to a refugee. In the end, the Anglo-Zanzibar War stands as a perfect example of imperial efficiency taken to its logical extreme. It was colonialism without complications, resistance without hope, and political change accomplished through the simple application of overwhelming firepower. 38 minutes was all it took to change the course of East African history, demolish a palace, end a reign, and create a legend that would outlast the empire that created it. The war began at 9:02 a.m. with the sound of British naval guns. It ended at 9:40 a.m. with the sight of Khalid fleeing his ruined palace. In between those two moments, an entire political order was destroyed and rebuilt, and hundreds of lives were lost, and the balance of power in East Africa was permanently altered. It was by any measure the most efficient 38 minutes in the history of international relations. And that, ultimately, is the story of the shortest war in history, a perfect demonstration of what happens when overwhelming technological superiority meets stubborn political resistance. The outcome was never in doubt, only the time it would take to achieve it. As it turned out, 38 minutes was more than enough. The individual stories of those 38 minutes paint an even more vivid picture of the war's peculiar nature. Consider Lieutenant Commander Edward Charlton, who had the distinction of firing the first shot of what would become the shortest war in recorded history. He later wrote to his wife that he had participated in a complete military campaign between breakfast and his morning tea. The letter, preserved in family archives, captures the surreal quality of the experience. "My dear Margaret, I have today conquered a sultanate and been home in time for lunch. The enemy showed considerable courage but insufficient artillery. A Charlton's gunner, a career sailor named Thomas Mitchell, had served in campaigns across the empire, from Burma to the Sudan. He would later tell his mates in Portsmouth that the Zanzibar action was the most efficient war he'd ever fought. Usually, he explained with the matter of fact tone that came from 20 years in the Navy. You spend months getting to the enemy, weeks fighting them, and more months getting home. This time I had my kit unpacked before the smoke cleared." Mitchell's log entry for August 27, 1896, reads simply, "Bombardment of Palace. Enemy resistance eliminated. No damage to ship. Ammunition expenditure minimal." On the receiving end, the experience was considerably less routine. Salim bin Rashid, one of Khalid's palace guards who survived the bombardment, later described the opening moments of the war to a British administrator conducting post-conflict interviews. His account, preserved in colonial archives, provides a ground-level perspective on what it was like to face the Royal Navy's displeasure. "The first shell hit the eastern wall while we were still eating our morning meal. We thought it was thunder, but thunder that shook the ground and filled the air with dust and stones. By the time we understood what was happening, the palace was already dying around us." Bin Rashid had been a guard for 12 years, had served under 3 different sultans, and had never imagined that his final day of service would last less than an hour. His description of the bombardment's progression is clinically precise. The British guns spoke in sequence, like drums in a terrible orchestra. First the eastern wall, then the northern courtyard, then the armory. They were not firing randomly, they were dismantling the palace piece by piece, room by room. We realized they knew the building better than we did. The palace servants who survived provided equally harrowing accounts. Fatima Bint said, who had worked in the palace kitchens for 15 years, was preparing the midday meal when the bombardment began. Her memoir, dictated years later to her grandson, captures the domestic perspective on imperial warfare. "I was grinding spices for the Sultan's lunch when the walls began to fall. We had prepared meals for 3 sultans, had weathered famines and celebrations, but none of us had ever prepared for the palace itself to disappear. By the time I gathered my wits, there was no kitchen left to cook in." What makes these individual accounts particularly poignant is their emphasis on the war's interruption of routine. These were people who had awakened expecting an ordinary day, guards to guard, servants to serve, administrators to administrate. Instead, they found themselves participants in a historical event that would be remembered long after their normal daily concerns were forgotten. The British participants, by contrast, treated the bombardment as an extension of their regular duties. Captain Frederick Pearson of HMS St. George wrote in his official report, "The reduction of the palace proceeded according to standard bombardment protocols. Target acquisition was straightforward, range was optimal, and enemy return fire was negligible. The action concluded when organized resistance ceased, and the primary objective was achieved." It was the kind of language that made the destruction of a century's palace sound like a routine maintenance procedure. But even among the British, there were those who recognized the unique nature of what they had accomplished. Admiral Rawson himself, in a private letter to his brother, admitted a certain professional satisfaction mixed with historical awareness. "We have today conducted what may be the briefest campaign in naval history. The speed of our success was such that I found myself wondering if we had perhaps been too efficient for our own good. Future historians will either marvel at our precision or question whether such rapid devastation was strictly necessary." The question of necessity would indeed become part of the war's historical legacy. Critics would argue that the British could have achieved their objectives through prolonged siege, economic pressure, or diplomatic isolation. Supporters countered that the swift, decisive action actually minimized casualties by preventing a longer, more drawn-out conflict. Both sides had valid points, but the debate missed the war's essential character. This was never about finding the most humane solution, but about demonstrating imperial power in its most concentrated form. The aftermath of the war revealed just how completely those 38 minutes had transformed Zanzibar's political landscape. Within hours of the bombardment's end, British administrators were already meeting with local merchants, religious leaders, and tribal representatives to establish the new order. The speed of these transitions was remarkable. By evening, the same men who had awakened as subjects of Sultan Khalid were swearing oaths of loyalty to Sultan Hamid. The efficiency of this political transformation was matched by the speed of the physical cleanup. British engineers had assessed the palace damage within hours and were already drawing up plans for reconstruction. The message was clear. The British could destroy a political order in 38 minutes and have a replacement ready before nightfall. It was administrative efficiency that would have been impressive in peacetime and was genuinely terrifying in the context of colonial control. Local merchants, who had initially worried that the conflict might disrupt trade, discovered that the opposite was true. The swift resolution of the succession crisis actually stabilized commercial relationships by eliminating uncertainty. British and Indian traders who had hesitated to make long-term commitments under Khalid were suddenly eager to expand their operations under Hamid. The war, however brief, had clarified the political situation in ways that months of negotiation might not have achieved. The religious establishment's response to the war was particularly telling. The Islamic clergy, who might have been expected to oppose the violent deposition of a Muslim ruler, largely accepted the transition with pragmatic resignation. Their reasoning was straightforward. Khalid's resistance had brought destruction to the Sultanate, while Hamid's cooperation promised stability and prosperity. The clerk's acceptance of the new order reflected a broader understanding that successful resistance to European power was no longer possible in late 19th century Africa. The social implications of the war extended far beyond Zanzibar itself. News of the 38-minute conflict spread throughout East Africa with remarkable speed, carried by traders, pilgrims, and colonial administrators. The story grew in the telling, but the essential message remained consistent. Challenging European authority was not just futile, but actively dangerous to one's health and architectural investments. Other African rulers drew obvious conclusions from Khalid's fate. The Sultan of Lamu, who had been considering resistance to increasing British influence, suddenly discovered a newfound enthusiasm for cooperation. The Kabaka of Baganda, facing similar pressures, decided that accommodation was preferable to annihilation. Across the region, local leaders who had been testing the boundaries of colonial authority suddenly became models of diplomatic compliance. The war's psychological impact was perhaps more significant than its immediate political consequences. The demonstration that European powers could eliminate African resistance in a matter of minutes fundamentally altered the calculus of political opposition. Previous conflicts had shown that Europeans could win, but the Anglo-Zanzibar War showed that they could win so quickly and completely that resistance became not just unsuccessful but meaningless. This psychological transformation was evident in the changing nature of colonial negotiations throughout East Africa. Before 1896, local rulers often approached discussions with European representatives as equals entering into negotiations. After Zanzibar, these same rulers understood that they were subjects receiving instructions. The difference was subtle but profound, and it was measured in the 38 minutes it had taken to reduce a palace to rubble. The British themselves were somewhat surprised by the war's broader impact. They had intended to resolve a local succession crisis, not to fundamentally alter the psychological landscape of East African politics. But the efficiency of their success had created a demonstration effect that resonated far beyond their original objectives. Colonial administrators throughout the empire began referencing the Zanzibar solution when dealing with recalcitrant local leaders. The war also had unexpected consequences for British military thinking. The demonstration that modern naval gunnery could resolve political problems with such remarkable efficiency influenced strategic planning throughout the empire. Military commanders began developing contingency plans for similar rapid interventions, viewing the Zanzibar model as a template for future colonial operations. But the war's brevity also created some practical problems for the British. Standard colonial procedures assumed that military interventions would provide time for careful political reconstruction. The 38-minute duration of the Zanzibar conflict meant that political solutions had to be implemented almost immediately, before the international community had time to react or local opposition had time to organize. This temporal compression created its own diplomatic challenges. European powers that might have objected to a prolonged British campaign simply didn't have time to formulate responses before the crisis was resolved. The German consul in Zanzibar, for example, was still drafting his government's position on the succession crisis when he received news that Khalid was requesting asylum. His dispatch to Berlin, preserved in German Foreign Ministry archives, captures the confusion. The situation has evolved with unprecedented rapidity. I am no longer reporting on a developing crisis, but on historical fact. The speed of the British victory also complicated traditional diplomatic protocols. International law in 1896 assumed that wars would provide time for neutral parties to evacuate nationals, protect commercial interests, and negotiate safe passage for non-combatants. The 38-minute duration of the Anglo-Zanzibar War simply didn't allow time for these standard procedures. Other European powers found themselves dealing with a fait accompli rather than a developing situation they could influence. French diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals considerable irritation with the British approach. The French consul in Zanzibar reported to Paris, "The British have resolved the succession question with such dispatch that our traditional diplomatic responses are no longer relevant. By the time we received instructions from the ministry, the crisis had been concluded and our potential influence eliminated." The French had prepared a careful diplomatic strategy for managing the Zanzibar situation, only to discover that the situation no longer existed. This diplomatic compression became a model for later British colonial interventions. The Zanzibar precedent established that rapid, overwhelming force could achieve political objectives before international complications could develop. Colonial administrators throughout the empire began arguing for similar approaches to local crises, reasoning that swift action eliminated both external interference and prolonged internal resistance. The war's influence on military technology was equally significant. The devastating effectiveness of naval bombardment against traditional fortifications encouraged further development of precision artillery. British munitions manufacturers used the Zanzibar results to market their products to colonial governments worldwide, advertising palace, clearing efficiency, and sultanate, reducing capability, with the kind of specificity that only comes from practical field testing. The psychological impact on British military personnel was complex. For career officers like Admiral Rawson, the war represented professional vindication, proof that modern naval power could achieve political objectives with maximum efficiency and minimum cost. For enlisted men like Gunner Thomas Mitchell, It was a demonstration of the technological superiority that made British global dominance possible. The war reinforced their confidence in the imperial project by showing just how easily local resistance could be eliminated. But some British participants also expressed unease about the war's one-sided nature. Lieutenant James Morrison, who served on HMS Philomel during the bombardment, wrote in his private diary, "The action today was less a battle than an execution. The enemy showed considerable bravery, but possessed no weapons capable of meaningful resistance. I cannot help but wonder if such overwhelming superiority makes victory meaningless." Morrison's concerns reflected a broader discomfort among some British officers about the nature of colonial warfare. This discomfort was largely overwhelmed by professional satisfaction and imperial pride. The war had demonstrated British efficiency, resolve, and technological superiority in the most dramatic possible terms. Colonial newspapers throughout the empire celebrated the victory with headlines emphasizing the speed and completeness of the success. The London Times editorial praising 38 minutes of decisive action that resolved months of uncertainty became typical of metropolitan British responses. The war's legacy in popular British culture was significant. Music hall songs celebrating the Zanzibar Minute became popular entertainment, with verses praising the Navy's efficiency and the Sultan's swift downfall. Children's books about the empire began including the war as an example of British technical and moral superiority. The 38-minute duration became a symbol of imperial effectiveness that resonated throughout British society, but the war's cultural impact was perhaps most profound in Zanzibar itself. The sudden, violent transformation of their political landscape became a defining moment in local consciousness. Elderly residents would later mark time by referring to events as happening before the bombardment or after the palace fell. The war created a temporal divide in Zanzibari society that lasted for generations. Local artistic traditions also reflected the war's impact. Traditional praise singers, who had once celebrated the power and permanence of the Sultanate, began composing works that emphasized the fragility of earthly authority. The bombardment became a metaphor for the unpredictability of fate and the dangers of challenging superior force. These artistic responses reveal how completely the 38-minute war had altered local understanding of political possibility. The economic consequences of the war extended far beyond the immediate destruction. The demonstration of British power attracted increased European investment, as merchants and financiers became confident that colonial authority could protect their interests. Trade volumes increased dramatically in the months following the war, as the elimination of political uncertainty encouraged commercial expansion. But this economic growth came at a social cost. The war had demonstrated the futility of resisting European dominance, encouraging a kind of cultural resignation that affected all aspects of Zanzibari society. Traditional political institutions lost legitimacy, not because they were formally abolished, but because they were seen as powerless against European technological superiority. The war's educational impact was equally profound. Local schools began teaching the conflict as a lesson in the importance of accepting reality, rather than fighting impossible battles. Children learned that heroic resistance, however admirable in principle, was simply impractical when facing overwhelming technological superiority. The war became a parable about the dangers of political miscalculation. These educational changes reflected broader transformations in how Zanzibari society understood its place in the world. The war had demonstrated that their island was not an independent political entity, but a peripheral territory whose fate was determined by European great power competition. This realization required fundamental adjustments in how local leaders approached politics, economics, and cultural development. The war's medical consequences were also significant. The wounded from the bombardment required treatment that exceeded local capabilities, necessitating European medical intervention. This created dependencies that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, as local medical traditions proved inadequate for treating injuries caused by modern artillery. European doctors became permanent fixtures in Zanzibari society, further extending colonial influence into previously autonomous spheres of life. Even the war's linguistic impact was notable. The phrase Zanzibar Minute entered local Swahili as a term for any brief but decisive action. Military terminology borrowed from English began appearing in local languages, reflecting the technological realities that the war had demonstrated. These linguistic changes reveal how completely the 38-minute conflict had penetrated local consciousness. The war's environmental consequences were equally lasting. The palace destruction created a massive debris field that took months to clear. The bombardment had also damaged the water supply system and disrupted sewage management, creating public health problems that persisted long after the political crisis was resolved. The physical reconstruction of Zanzibar became a visible reminder of the war's impact for years after the last shell had fallen. These environmental effects extended beyond immediate destruction. The war had demonstrated that traditional architectural defences were meaningless against modern artillery, leading to fundamental changes in how buildings were designed and constructed. Future Zanzibari architecture began incorporating European defensive concepts, creating a built environment that reflected the new political realities. The war's demographic impact was also significant. Many of Khalid's supporters fled Zanzibar after his defeat, creating a refugee population that scattered throughout East Africa. These exiles carried stories of the bombardment to distant communities, spreading awareness of British military capabilities far beyond Zanzibar itself. Their accounts became warnings about the consequences of challenging European authority. Conversely, the war attracted new residents to Zanzibar. European merchants, administrators, and technical specialists were drawn to the island by the stability that British control provided. This immigration changed the social composition of Zanzibar's elite, creating a more cosmopolitan, but also more colonial society. The war's technological legacy extended well beyond military applications. The precision of British naval gunnery had demonstrated the possibilities of accurate long-range fire, influencing civilian engineering projects throughout the colonial world. Harbour construction, building design, and infrastructure development all began incorporating lessons learned from the bombardment's devastating effectiveness. These technological applications revealed the war's broader significance as a demonstration of industrial civilization's capabilities. The 38 minutes of bombardment represented years of accumulated technical knowledge and industrial capacity focused on a single political objective. It was a display of how completely European industrial development had transformed the possibilities of power projection. Looking back across more than a century, the Anglo-Zanzibar War remains a remarkable historical anomaly. Its 38-minute duration makes it unique among military conflicts, but its broader significance lies in what it revealed about the nature of late 19th century imperial power. The war was simultaneously a small local crisis and a demonstration of global historical forces. The individuals who participated in those 38 minutes could hardly have imagined that their brief experience would become a historical landmark. Lieutenant Commander Charlton died in 1923, having served in campaigns across the empire, but his obituary mentioned the Zanzibar action, first among his military achievements. Gunner Mitchell retired to Portsmouth, where he would entertain pub patrons for decades with stories of the shortest war in history. Salim bin Rashid, the palace guard who survived the bombardment, lived until 1954, becoming one of the last eyewitnesses to the conflict. His final interview, conducted by a British historian in 1953, concluded with a reflection that captured the war's essential character. 38 minutes changed everything. We had thought the palace was permanent, the Sultan was powerful, and resistance was possible. The British ships taught us that nothing was permanent except their guns. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson of the shortest war in history. That in the age of industrial empire, political change could be measured not in years or months, but in the time it took for modern artillery to reduce traditional authority to rubble. 38 minutes was enough to end a reign, destroy a palace, and demonstrate the new rules of international relations. It was efficiency and devastation combined in a perfect historical moment that illuminated the true nature of colonial power.